Good morning and welcome everybody to our IOD members and other governance professionals on this webinar this morning. As you are aware, during 2024, we notified our members that King 4 was under review for a number of reasons. And then there was a lot of work done behind the scenes, and where we've come to now, obviously you're aware, is that King 5 was sent out for public comment very recently. So what we thought we'd do is host this session just to give people some background and share some thinking around why the changes, etc. And we thought that could inform the comment letters that will be coming through later on as we near the comment deadline date. So we had great interest in this webinar. We had over 1,000 registrations, and I see the numbers keep growing. There are about just 350 participants now, but they keep growing by the second. So really great to have you all on this webinar. It's mainly going to be hosted by Ansi. For those who don't know Ansi, she's a former CEO of the IODSA. She's a lawyer by profession, a chartered director SA, and most relevant to this morning is she's chair of the King Committee. So just one note from me before I hand over to Ansi is there is a chat box which you'll all be probably familiar with. Please feel free to chat with each other in the chat box. But if you have specific questions for Ansi that you'd like answered, if you can put that in the Q&A box for us, please, because that's what we'll be monitoring when it comes to the Q&A session. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the session. And Ansi, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Pami, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm looking forward to sharing with you the work that the King Committee has done on the King 5 draft and to hear your responses and comments today, as well as in the formal comment process. I do think that we are all aligned in our intention, namely that we just want to do what we can to improve corporate governance in South Africa and, dare I say, in Southern Africa. Before we start properly, I see Professor Mervyn King is online, and I just want to acknowledge him. Mervyn, we're going to use your name in vain very often this morning, and thank you for your attendance and your support. So with that, as Pami has said, the purpose of this session is to give you some insight and information on our thinking when we drafted King 5 to enable you and to facilitate a more constructive comment process and hopefully take some of the burden off you to do all of the studying of the documents yourself. After the session, the aim is that when you go through the documents, it should be fairly straightforward and evident, and you can then tell us what you think about how we've addressed certain issues. So I'm going to start off with an introduction in which I'm just going to deal with the reasons for the review of King 4. I'm also going to give you the bottom line as to what has changed. And then lastly, I will take you through the documents that have been published for comment. I'll then move on to addressing the overarching changes, and then from there go into the detail as to the changes to the individual principles and practice recommendations. And we will conclude with the Q&A session. So the objectives of the review were really threefold. Firstly, as you can expect, to accommodate developments locally and internationally in the sphere of corporate governance. Those developments include the recent amendments to the Companies Act, the evolving practices in remuneration governance, also the trends that one can note from the proposed amendments to the Companies Act, global developments in sustainability reporting and the issuing of sustainability reporting standards. And then lastly, but very importantly, the rapidly advancing technological landscape. We had to review King IV to cater for all of these developments. Unfortunately, as far as the changes to the Companies Act are concerned, those have not all been made effective. So um, um, we had to navigate through the uncertainty, and I will explain to you exactly how we've addressed it. As to sustainability reporting, we're facing a similar situation in that things are very much fluid and in flux, but we have found a way to deal with it even during this period that we're facing uncertainty. And I will share with you also how we've approached that aspect. The second objective of the review was to simplify King V and to make it more user-friendly and accessible. I said at the beginning when I started the session that we really all aligned, I think, in our desire and intent on making King V, whatever our code of corporate governance is, more making it improving governance in South Africa. And one of the ways to improve it is to make it as easy as possible for those who apply to implement. And that's what we attempted to do with the draft of King IV. Very keen to hear your comments in this respect and whether the draft of King V is achieving this purpose. The last objective was to standardize disclosure, and I will give more details when we get to this section as to how this is going to work. Now, before I give you the bottom line on what has changed, I thought we could ease ourselves into a conversation and have some fun by just dealing with the statements that were made by or have been made by the media in their coverage on the draft of King V. And I think that's a nice way to just touch upon the pertinent issues. The first statement that was made was that King V will not prevent corporate failure. And on this, we can all agree. But I also venture to say that King V will not prevent corporate failures, but the changes to the Companies Act will not prevent corporate failures. The PFMA will not prevent corporate failures. There is no piece of legislation that will prevent corporate failures. There is a certain domain in which King V operates, and I'll talk more about that, but yes, certainly it's not our expectation that King V will prevent corporate failures. The other assertion that was made was that it is a pity that the sanctions for breaches of the code are so lightweight, and seeing that the sanctions are so lightweight, is it of any effect? Is it of any consequence? So I put here that we agree and we disagree. Yes, King V, King IV, our King codes are voluntary codes on corporate governance. But there are three things that should be kept in mind. The first is that these codes are supported by regulators and other institutions when they regulate and exercise oversight of other organizations. Two examples here, the JSE and the Auditor General, who support the King codes of corporate governance. The other thing that must be kept in mind here is that albeit that our codes of corporate governance are voluntary, our courts are very often using it as a reference point to determine whether a director or directors have acted in accordance with the standard of conduct as is expected from them per their legal duties. So in this way, the Code of Corporate Governance has found its way into our common law, and so it's therefore arguable that it's entirely voluntary. I would submit that it has legal consequences indeed if it's not followed. Over and above the formal legal consequences of breaching our code of conduct is the fact that social and market forces discipline companies and sanction companies and organizations who do not follow the code. Those sanctions could lead to those organizations losing their social license of operate, which is sometimes a severer sanction than the legal sanction. So yes, it is a voluntary code, but it has consequences, sometimes severe. The statement was also made that there are stricter independence guidelines. And again, we're answering yes and no. Yes, we've tightened up on some of the independence guidelines. A majority of the non-executive directors that is required on the board, that has always been the case. We've tightened up on cooling off period, and the 9-year service as a director has been included in the factors that have to be considered for independence. The 9 years is not new, it's just included as part of all the other factors that need to be considered on a holistic basis when determining whether a director is independent. It's also been stated that there's a new requirement for organizations to align with environmental sustainability and social transformation. That is not true. This is something that comes from the triple bottom line of King II being progressed in the triple context of King III and is very much part of the triple context of King IV. But what is true is that the King codes, unlike the European codes, do not focus solely on investor protection. Then it's also said that there's a new reference to Ubuntu. Of course, also not new by any means. It says King V aims to be simpler with 17 principles, now reduced to 12. That is indeed the case. And then it's also mentioned as new, the consideration of internal pay equity, that King V is more specific in that it requires the REM policy to address organization-wide REM, and that there is no disclosure on steps taken if the REM vote fails to achieve 75%. All of these assertions around remuneration are incorrect. It is indeed been part of King IV to address all of these things. And since disclosure is now moved out of King V to the disclosure template, the steps to be taken if the REM vote fails to achieve 75% is very much addressed in the disclosure template. So I think the overarching theme that you can see here is that there are quite a number of things that are mentioned as new in King V, whereas they've actually been part of a longer tradition of our King codes. And so the bottom line I'll give you as such. The bottom line is that outside of the 3 objectives that I mentioned to you and the changes necessitated by achieving those objectives, organizations applying King IV already will have very little difficulty to transition to King 5. Those organizations who are already applying King 4 will find the transition fairly straightforward. And I hope that provides some comfort. Maybe I can just also add that if you look at the transition from King 3 to King 5, I would venture to say, but I'm quite comfortable in that view, that the transition from King 4 to King 5 will be less of an issue even than it was from King 3 to King 4. So just to give you, those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the documents that have been published for comment, there are 3 documents that have been published. The one is the code itself, and then also the glossary and the disclosure template. Our plan initially was to publish the code and the disclosure template because those 2 should be read in tandem. The King 4 code contains the practices that need to be implemented, and then the disclosure template supplements that by containing the practices that need to be, that guide disclosure. So the code is what needs to be implemented. The disclosure template is what needs to be disclosed. So those 2 aspects are kept separately. But as we came closer towards the publication of the document and we worked through them, it became evident to us that we can't publish the code and the template without clarifying certain of the terminology. For example, Ubuntu. What do we understand under Ubuntu? What does it mean? What is our understanding of assurance, and so forth. And so we made the decision to publish the glossary with the code and the disclosure template. And really, I think I've implied it, but just to emphasize that the code, the glossary, and the disclosure template, these 3 documents form an integral whole. You cannot read the code without appreciating what needs to be disclosed. You cannot apply and interpret the code without appreciating how to interpret the terminology that we've used, because we were very intentional about the terminology that we used. In the invitation for public comment, there was an information document included. The information document is really the document from which the other documents hang. The information document contains the links to these 3 other documents. And what we've done is we've included in the information document a summary of all the changes, and it follows more or less the structure that I'm using this morning for this presentation. But you can read the changes, and then as you read a summary of the changes from King 4, you will then be invited to comment on these different changes. So hopefully that also makes your life easier and the comment process easier. Okay, let me then give you a sense of the overarching changes that we effected. And then from there, I'll move into the detail as to the principles and the practices at a high level. Now, the first change is how we intend presenting King 5. King 4 currently is a single report which consists of multiple parts. So the code is one of the parts of the more comprehensive King report. King 5, we propose a deconstructed presentation for. The reason why we want to separate the various parts of King 4 and not present it as one complete booklet is because we have found that the there's almost like a psychological barrier with those who have to implement the report not recognizing actually how short and brief the code itself is. It's almost as if the code gets hidden within all of the other documents. And conversely, or ironically, because the code is because the code is the document that people focus on, because it's all bound together, it's almost also if there's no appreciation for the significance of these other documents. So visually, we thought it may add to an understanding of what these documents are that fit together, and how they work together if we make all of these documents accessible from a single web page. Visually, on this web page, you will then be able to see or click through to the code, the disclosure template, the glossary, fundamental concepts, and the application and disclosure regime as separate documents. But on the web page, they will be accessible from a single point. There will also be ancillary documents, as you can expect, and ancillary information, such as who the members of the King Committee are, the backgrounds and the reasons for the drafting of King 5, and other guidance documents. So really the idea behind the deconstructed presentation is to make everything visually more accessible and to place the spotlight on the code and the emphasis on how brief the code actually is. And maybe that will just remove that psychological barrier to seeing the implementation of King 5 as a mammoth task. Speaking of guidance documents, the sector supplements, you will know, are currently part of the King 4 report. Those supplements will be replaced, and one guidance document will be published as part of all of the other guidance papers to guide implementation of King 5 in the various sectors. We're currently working on this document, and it will hopefully be published with the King 5 final document. The use of graphics and design elements in King 5 will be limited so as to make it accessible for reading impaired individuals. We've realized subsequent to the publication of King 4 that the graphics and the design elements actually impede the use of it. The other reason is also to align the style of the code with regulatory drafting convention. So what you can expect to see with the final King 5 code is a very clean presentation of the code, very clean and formal presentation. The second overarching change has to do with the accessibility, which is what we're trying to achieve through simplification of language and of content. So what that involves is that we tried as far as we could to avoid technical terms. So I gave you two examples on the slide there. The one is 6 capitals and the other one is triple context. Now, both these terms we use currently in King 4. So, and if you then read the King 4 code, and you read a practice recommendation that mentions 6 capitals, if you do not understand what this concept means, it makes it difficult for you to read the practice recommendation. So instead of using the term, we now using the descriptive phrase, the resources and relationships that the organization uses and affects. So we describe rather than using the technical term. Same with triple context. Instead of talking about triple context, we're writing it out. We refer to the economy, to the society, and the natural environment that establish the context within which the organization operates or within which it is embedded. The glossary. We've updated the glossary and we've simplified and clarified the definitions insofar as we could. Recommended practices, we've streamlined somewhat. We've evaluated each of the practice recommendations currently in King 4. We've evaluated for its significance and made an assessment as to whether the practice recommendation is essential and primary to the achievement of the principle that it supports, or whether it is merely supplementary and supportive. When we came to the conclusion, to the determination that the practice recommendation was supplementary and supportive, we then took the practice recommendation out, and those practice recommendations are earmarked to be included in more detailed guidance documents. Now, this is, of course, a judgment call as to what is primary and essential for the achievement of a particular principle. And so keen to get your comments on this aspect also, as to whether we got that balance right. The third overarching change, and I almost hesitate to call it a change, but let's say the area that I want to cover with respect to change is the philosophy and approach of King 5. And the reason why I'm hesitating to call it a change is because it's really a change in form rather than in substance. As an illustration of this, the scope of King 5 remains as it is in King 4. King 5 would apply to all organizations regardless of their form of incorporation. We've maintained the forms of address, namely organizations and governing bodies. This is in keeping with the objective that we had with King 4 already, to say that corporate governance and our King 4 code is applicable to all organizations, and therefore we're using terminology that's more general and not alienating to those organizations that do not have boards and directors. So that remains exactly the same. As far as the executive summary is concerned that is mentioned here, what we've done is, well, let me take one step back. In King 4, you know that there's a section called Fundamental Philosophy. And the fundamental philosophy has to do, fundamental concepts, pardon. Fundamental concepts has to do with the philosophy and the approach to King 4 in some detail. So it explains concepts like integrated thinking, integrated reporting, sustainability, Ubuntu. It explains at a high level the changes made from King 3 to King 4. Now, what we found was with King 4, many people would not take the time to read the section on fundamental concepts, and therefore misunderstood, misinterpret, or not appreciate the depth and the richness of what is provided for in the code itself. So what we've done with the draft of King 5 is we took the essence out of fundamental concepts, and we included it in an executive summary that precedes the code itself, the principles and the practices. And this we do for convenient reference. It's just easier if it's in one place in a succinct way. But it's also to highlight the importance of reading and interpreting the code against the setting of its fundamentals and its philosophy. And I was actually so gratified when I read in the media coverage around King 5 that some things are picked up as new. And the reason why they picked up as new is because I think it's now included in the executive summary. So it's more visible. And that's exactly what we tried to achieve. As far as the content of the executive summary is concerned, the fundamental concepts themselves, it's very little difference between that and what you find in King 4 currently. Yes, we tweaked some of the wording, clarified, tried to put it more succinctly, but in substance, it has not changed. What we will do with King 5 is that we will have a detailed section on fundamental concepts, which will be published together with the King 5 final document. And this is then the document that can be read by those who really want to immerse themselves a little bit deeper into what underpins the thinking behind King 5. Because that is, after all, one of the elements that set aside the king tradition of corporate governance from, I venture to say, any other in the world. Lastly, on philosophy and approach, how do we approach contemporary topics and concerns? With contemporary topics and concerns, I'm referring to things like the pace of change and instability in the operating environment, disruptive technology, climate change and nature risks, transformation and social inequality. Now, we have not changed our report from King 4 as to how we deal with these topics and concerns. We deal with these at a high level and not in a siloed approach. We don't deal with the specifics. One of the main ways that we deal with it is through looking at these through the lens of risk, and that all of these need to be incorporated in your organization-wide risk management framework. So we put a lot of emphasis on the fact that when the organization needs to be cognizant of its operating environment, the context in which it operates. And as I explained before, that context consists of the economic, social, and environmental context in which it operates, and need to respond to these risks and opportunities that this context poses constructively and meaningfully. Now, this approach, this idea of having to be responsive to the risk and opportunities in your operating context is something that is a thematic thread throughout the code. And that's how we deal with these issues. So when in the principle where we talk about organizational ethics, under corporate citizenship, we mention that organizations need to be cognizant of the impact on the economy, society, and the environment. When an organization, next principle, develops strategy, the organization needs to take into account the risks and opportunities posed to it by its operating environment. And then when the when the execution of the strategy is monitored, at the same time, the organization needs to monitor negative impact on the economy, society, and the environment. And reporting follows that same thematic thread. You find it under almost all of the principles, right through to the last principle that deals with stakeholder inclusivity, because stakeholder inclusivity is really, stakeholders are really the representation of the economic, social, and environmental context in which the organization operates. So that's how we've approached these contemporary issues at a very high level rather than specific. We believe that it's more important to establish the principle of integrating these in your operations and governance rather than looking at each as a silo. Fourthly, which I also hesitate almost to call it change, is the structural, how did we deal with the structural components of the code? Under structural components, I mean the outcomes, the principles, and the practices, of course. And so here I'm going to give you just a quick crash course or revision on what you can already find in King 4, but I think it's important that we emphasize. As far as the outcomes are concerned, that is fairly similar. We maintain the 4 outcomes. The one that has changed is, in terms of its wording, is what we now call conformance. In King 4, we call this effective control, but it refers to the same thing. Other than that, other than conformance, we have performance. Performance and conformance, of course, need to be seen together. Often, corporate governance is viewed as a defensive stance. In other words, it's very much around what we talk about here. It's effectiveness, consistency, and discipline with respect to adherence by the organization to laws, regulations, and adopted standards, as well as the establishment and monitoring of the system of internal controls. If you have to call up an idea of what corporate governance is, I think most people, 80% of people, would come up with something that reads like that, or something that conveys that sort of an idea. But corporate governance is not only about conformance, it's also about performance, is that the organization creates value within its economic, social, and environmental context in a sustainable manner. Failure to create value is a failure, is just as much a corporate governance failure as non-conformance. And then the 2 bookmarks at the end, ethical culture stands for the shared values, beliefs, and practices within the organization that promote ethical behavior and decision-making. Legitimacy then is the organization having a good reputation and being trusted as a result of responsible corporate citizenship and strong stakeholder relationships. Now, these descriptions of what each outcome means, those are new. We did not include descriptions in King 4. And we found that, we thought that it would be evident, but we found that these outcomes were interpreted differently and sometimes misunderstood. So we added these descriptions, but the notions behind them remain the same. So these outcomes are then the benefits that you could realize. These outcomes then are the benefits that an organization could realize if it follows sound governance. The principles is almost the unpacking of these outcomes into the various subject areas or domains of corporate governance. The principles we're treating exactly the same as in King IV. We are saying that the principles are essential and foundational to effective governance. Once an organization sets out to follow good governance, it can no longer be argued that we are not striving to apply any of the principles. That's how they've been phrased, that it's basic to your striving for governance, for good governance, to apply these principles. Therefore, they are universally applicable across the various types, sizes, and nature of organizations. The one change that we did make was that we articulated all of the principles in the present tense to reflect the essential and lasting nature of the aspirations that these principles contain. So each principle is in the present tense. It's because it's enduring. It's an enduring truth of corporate governance. And that's the idea that we wanted to convey. We have simplified the phrasing of some of them. Some of them were a bit wordy or difficult to understand. We tried to simplify it. And then Principle 17, which is the principle that spoke to institutional investors, we've deleted from King V. The reason we've done so, or the reason why we've included it in King IV, was that we made an attempt to link the King Code of Corporate Governance, which is which speaks to governing bodies. We try to link that to the Code for Responsible Investing, which speaks to institutional investors. So Principle 17 was directed at the governing body of institutional investors such as pension funds, retirement funds, insurance companies. And the idea was that these governing bodies had to oversee that these institutional investors executed their responsibilities and rights in a sustainable way, in a way that would promote good governance in the companies that they invest. But because Principle 17 is somewhat of an outlier in that it didn't have universal application, it was out of step with the other principles. And after a discussion, we made the decision to rather emphasize the point that we believe that it's important that institutional investors apply CRISA, which provides for responsible stewardship, and that we keep the two codes separate, albeit that we absolutely recognize the importance of institutional investors following the CRISA code. And then, as you've heard before, the principles are now reduced from 17 to 12. As far as the practices are concerned, that is the one component of structural component of the code that changed the most, in the sense that we just reviewed these for streamlining of language, and we reduced the number of practices in the way that I explained before. Scaling of practices is still permissible and indeed advisable in accordance with proportionality. Proportionality, in turn, is informed by the size of an organization, the nature and complexity of its business model, and the scale of its impact. So an organization, a smaller organization, which is less complex and has limited impact on its external environment, can apply more proportionality, exactly the same as in King IV. And then the last overarching change that I want to talk to is the introduction of the disclosure template. And arguably that is the most significant change from King 4 to King 5. Perhaps, again, this is a change in form rather than in substance, although there are substantive issues that changed somewhat, which I will talk you through. But the application, the apply and explain regime remains exactly the same, meaning that application of principles is assumed because principles, as I've said, are basic and fundamental to a system of good governance. Doesn't matter how small, how informal that system is. We're saying the principles are basic and fundamental. So application of the principles is assumed, but where you do need to explain is around the practices. And that situation is exactly the same as it was in King 4. Now, the disclosure template now accompanies the code, and I mean that very literally, because you need to read the practices for implementation in the code together with the disclosure practices. And I would argue that implementation is not completed until you've closed the loop with disclosure on your corporate governance. So the disclosure practices are now in the disclosure template, so that establishes the content. And then, of course, the disclosure template itself establishes the format in which these disclosures need to be made. One point I want to emphasize is that we make very clear that the governing body needs to sign off on the disclosure template. That actually stands to reason if you take into account that the governing body is the focal point of governance in the organization. And therefore, any disclosure that centers around the governance of the organization needs to be approved by the governing body. So the question then is, why did the King Committee decide to introduce the disclosure template? And our aim with that is really twofold. Firstly, it's to assist those who use corporate governance reports, who consume those reports. And then secondly, it's to assist with tracking of implementation and disclosure. So assisting those who have to implement on the other end. So let's look at the first one, the one that assists those who use the reports. The aim of the disclosure template is to provide for consistency and accessibility for regulators, shareholders, and other users of the reports of governance. The commentary that we received after King 4 and in our consultation process from regulators and shareholders was that it's very difficult to access corporate governance disclosure. What makes it difficult is that most organizations disclose their implementation of corporate governance in various places across their annual report or their integrated report. So it's very difficult to get a cohesive picture as to the quality of governance in a particular organization. And other than that, there's no consistency from one organization to the other, not even in terms of what is covered, let alone the detail around what is covered. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is we all know that when a code of corporate governance needs to be implemented, what we do is we take those practices, we plot them on a spreadsheet, and then then that's how we implement and consider the practices as to whether they're going to be implemented, and if so, where we are with it. So this is almost like a bridge to a bridge to that, from that step to disclosure. This is also a format in which organizations internally can disclose and report to the board as to the state of their implementation on King 5. And then there's internal disclosure, and of course the ultimate idea is that the disclosure template should be used for public disclosure, and we suggest that organizations post this template on their website so that it's accessible. The content, the level of disclosure works as follows. It's very similar to what we provided for in King 4. However, I don't think this was always meticulously followed, sometimes not even loosely followed. The one change is that in King 5 is that it's now required that practices which are not implemented are stated and explained. So the reason why those practices have not been implemented and what mitigating processes have been introduced to ensure that that there's not a risk introduced by not implementing the practice. So that is different, because in King 4 there was no requirement to specifically state if a practice had not been implemented. The reason why we've tightened up on this is that the commentary again from our regulators and shareholders was that the requirements for disclosure in King 4 was too loose and too not specific enough. What remains the same is that there needs to be, as far as the practices that have been implemented, there needs to be a narrative included on how these practices work together to achieve the aspiration as per the principle. That's exactly the same as in King 4. There are also, like as in King 4, specific disclosures provided for under certain principles. For example, the principle on the composition of governing bodies, that principle does provide, or those disclosure practices do provide for specific disclosures around the members of the governing body. Same with the principle that addresses the audit committee. There are certain specific disclosures that need to be made with regards to the audit committee's execution of its duties and responsibilities. Now, the idea with this is not to create more reporting. The idea with this is to provide a mechanism for reporting that actually makes sense within the current reporting framework. So, as I said before, we recommend that organizations post their corporate governance reporting on their website so that it's publicly accessible. Now, that means that once this disclosure template has been completed, all that you have to do is to review it when there are changes, or otherwise every year, to just update it with further information. It's not necessary to create a new template every year. So that, we believe, will take some of the burden of reporting off. And then the idea is that organizations should make liberal use of links from their disclosure template to their other reports, and from their other reports to the disclosure template so that there's not duplicate reporting. But what will remain fairly consistent over financial years would be the disclosure template. It just gets updated every year or when there are changes. And that's why we also believe it's a useful tracking mechanism for organizations internally. So I hope this explanation clarifies our intent behind the disclosure template and its use. Maybe just a last point before I step off this, as to the links, the one condition that we placed on the use of links is that you cannot insert under Principle 1 a link to the integrated report. Your link must be specific to the information required under Principle 1. In other words, you can't link to the integrated report generally, but you can link to the section in the integrated report where the Principle 1 information is dealt with. Okay, let me then, as the last section, take you through the changes of the individual principles and associated practices. Now, just as a reminder, there are now not 17 principles, but 16. We've, on the slides, given you the wording of the current principles and of the proposed wording in King 5. You can see Principle 1 has been combined with the old Principle 6. And it reads as follows: the governing body leads ethically and effectively as the focal point of corporate governance in the organization. When we considered the two principles, and this is the motivation for the combination of many of them, it is really one concept or one idea or one, as we call it, governance domain or subject area for the governing body to lead ethically and effectively and to be the focal point of governance in the organization. It's all one idea, and therefore we thought it better, in the interest of streamlining content, to combine those as they convey a single idea. What we're also dealing with under Principle 1 is the evaluation of the governing body of its performance. I suppose you can say that we've removed Principle 9 and made it part of the practices under Principle 1. The idea being that a board arranging for the evaluation of its own performance, that of its committees and its members, that is really a mechanism by which the governing body holds itself accountable. That's how you exemplify and embody the fact that you lead ethically and effectively. And so that was the thinking under including Principle 9, also under Principle 1. The practices have remained largely intact. Those practices that are associated with Principle 6, that's the governing body being the focal point, that one is, and those of Principle 9 have been simplified and reduced somewhat. Principle 2, governance of ethics. Here again, we've combined the organizational ethics principle and the corporate citizenship principle, because corporate citizenship is just, again, an exemplification of how you act ethically as an organization. So it really introduces, it deals with one concept, and so therefore we've combined those two principles and the practices. The practices are very similar from King 4 to King 5. The strategy and sustainable value creation principle. Principle 4, which was the strategy and performance principle, is somewhat wording, and you need to understand the concept of integrated reporting and the six capitals model and that depiction of value creation before you would understand what this principle envisaged. So we have simplified the wording somewhat in the new principle 3, which talks about the governing body ensures that the organization's purpose, business model, and strategy result in sustainable value creation within its economic, social, and environmental context. We hope that that's more straightforward and understandable. The practice recommendations have been, the wording has been simplified to state them more succinctly, and the logical flow of the principles have been addressed. What I mean by that is the practice recommendations start off with providing that the governing body directs the formulation of and implementation of strategy. The governing body approves policy and planning, and then pointing to all of the issues that need to be taken into account before strategy gets approved by the governing body, including the economic, social, and environmental context as an example of how that was worked in. And then the governing body monitors execution, and then disclosure is, of course, dealt with in the disclosure template. Then moving on to principle 4, which is the reporting principle. The wording has also somewhat been adjusted somewhat, but I think the wording in King 4 was already quite succinct, and so we just added some points of clarity, but it looks very similar. Now, I said to you that we had to navigate our way around the uncertainty of sustainability reporting, where integrated reporting is going to end up. So the way that we've dealt with it is we try to deal with it on a more in a way that would not date the code. So what we said is that in the practices is that the governing body should be involved in the determination of the reporting standards, the frameworks, and the guidelines used for reporting to the extent that these are not prescribed by legislation. Okay. So even if the underlying legislation changes, this practice recommendation will remain true. So the governing body needs to be involved in the determination of the reporting standards, frameworks, and guidance used by the organization. Then furthermore, the governing body needs to be involved in the consideration of the suite of reports to be issued by the organization. So we're not prescribing that is something that the governing body needs to consider. The one specific recommendation that we do make is we recommend that an integrated report be issued at least annually, which is reflected of integrated thinking and the organization's participation in sustainable development. The way that we conceptualize the integrated report going forward, and we worked with the IRC in South Africa on this, is that the integrated report will probably, once everything around reporting has settled, will probably be the umbrella that connects all of the other reports information together. And that's how we propose it here. And then lastly is that we recommend that the basis for materiality of sustainability information should encompass both financial materiality and impact materiality. To put it in short, we support a double materiality approach. Now, this is not different from King 4, but it was implied in King 4 In King 5, the draft, we're now much more definitive about it. Principle 5, the composition of the governing body. Again, the wording of the principle has been changed somewhat and simplified. It now reads, the composition of the governing body is balanced with respect to the mix of competencies, diversity, and independence that enables it to discharge its governance role and responsibilities objectively and effectively. So it's balanced with respect to competencies, diversity, and independence. So it's very similar to the old Principle 7, but somewhat simplified. What we've changed in the practice is the main thing to mention there is that we've tweaked the independence criteria. What remains is that all of the independence criteria together constitute the factors that need to be taken into account on a holistic basis and on a substance over form basis when determining whether a director can be categorized as independent or not. So that remains exactly as in King 4. These criteria should be considered holistically and on a substance over form basis. Where we've tweaked is that we are now mentioning also parties related to the member of the governing body as something that needs to be taken into account in the independence categorization of a member of the governing body. We're more specific about cooling off periods. And then the 9 years of service as a non-executive director is included together with all of the other factors as a criterion that may affect independence and should be considered together with the other factors. So back to that point that it's a holistic consideration on a substance over form basis. The 9 years is not new. It's already in King 4, but it's in a separate practice, not together with all of the other practices or factors, not together with all of the other factors. Principle 6 has to do with the committees of the governing body. That's the old Principle 8. Here we've simplified the wording. It now reads, the governing body ensures that arrangements for delegation to its committees and individuals within its own structures support the objective and effective discharge of its governance responsibilities. What has changed around the practices is that delegation by the governing body to its committees is now addressed throughout the code. So when we, under the ethics principle, the organizational ethics and corporate citizenship principle, when we talk about which committee oversees it, we talk about it under that principle. And same with the risk principle and IT principle and so forth. The delegation is mentioned under each principle and not mentioned generically as it is in King 4. It's just to provide more guidance as to where it typically sits, because that's a question that we often get. We do not repeat the provisions of the Companies Act or any other legislation for that matter. So it needs to be appreciated that when the King 5 code is read, and this is similar to King 4, it must be read in conjunction with applicable legislation. We don't repeat legislation in King 5. As far as the Risk Committee and the Social and Ethics Committee is concerned, there is now a practice recommendation that states that a majority of the members should be non-executive. That's the same as in King 4. But what is different is that we now add that at least one member of these committees must be or should be independent. So also keen to hear your comments on that, and there's a specific question included on your thoughts as to whether this is a constructive a recommendation which will lead to more objectivity in these committees. Principle 7, appointment and delegation to management. The principle has been somewhat simplified. It now reads, the governing body ensures that the appointment of and delegation to management result in operational effectiveness and clarity on authority and responsibilities. I think quite crisp and succinct. Principles, practices remain largely the same. Principle 8, risk and compliance. Here again, we've combined two principles because compliance realistically and in practice cannot be governed outside the risk system. In fact, these two work very closely in tandem. So the principle now reads, the governing body governs risk and compliance to enable the organization to expand its opportunities and set and achieve its strategic objectives. Just a comment on this phrasing, expand its opportunities, enable the organization to expand its opportunities. This is a reference to strategic thinking, to that performance aspect. This is a reference to the fact that risk management can't only be defensive. Risk management should also open up strategic opportunities. So it should also be focused on opportunities so that the company can expand its opportunities. In other words, develop its strategy effectively. The practices have been somewhat simplified, but they're largely the same under these two, under this new principle 8, which combines the old principle 11 and 13. Information governance. Now, this is this section in King 5 that changed the most. I venture to say that it's a rewrite, almost. Let's start with the principle. The principle says the governing body governs information and its deployment through technologies to enable the organization to expand its opportunities and set and achieve its strategic objectives. So information governance is now the heading of this principle. We use information governance, and this caused quite a bit of discussion and research and consultation with outside parties as to how all of these different components fit together. Where we landed was that information governance is the overarching concept, and its strategic imperative is to ensure that information is managed in a way that maximizes its value to the organization. Now, information being a very broad concept in this sense. Information technology, IT, data, and emerging technologies are related components and converging technologies within the broader information governance framework. That's how we conceptualized this principle and its practice recommendations. So with that, I'm just going to read the principle again so that you grasp what I'm talking about. It says here, the governing body governs information and the deployment of information through technologies. The technologies that we're referring to here is information technologies, data, and emerging technologies. And then you will see that we dealt with each of the risks associated to these using the risks as and opportunities as the governance lens to be applied. The practice recommendations have really been rewritten to address the objectives and risks to the governance of IT, data, and artificial intelligence as an emerging technology. So here as well, very keen to hear your comments, especially the experts on these technologies, and to hear whether this makes sense and assists with the governance of information. And what we try to emphasize here before I move on is that it should be approached very strategically. And that's why we leveled it up to its higher level, namely information governance, because that is the overarching strategic objective from which the deployment of these other technologies should flow, especially these days when it has become such a strategic issue. Principle 10, remuneration governance. The wording slightly tweaked, and of course in the present tense, like all of the other principles. What we've done is we've deleted the previous voting practices, and we've replaced it by a practice that says that non-binding votes on remuneration should be taken by companies that must have their annual financial statements audited, but are not subject to the provisions of the Act in relation to voting on remuneration. So the way that we phrase this practice is that it caters for the current situation where there is actually no regulation or legislation in force on voting on any company. So we're saying that those companies which that must have the financial statements audited in the absence of legislation, they need to provide for a vote on the remuneration policy and the remuneration report. That's how we've dealt with that. And then the practices have been simplified. So we've also deleted a number of practices under this principle. The assurance principle has been simplified. The practices have been reduced and simplified quite a bit. The practices under combined assurance has been reduced to make it more succinct and readable. There was a bit of repetition and overlap there. The subsection assurance of external reports has been deleted in its entirety because that is catered for under assurance standards and the such. And then internal audit, that is the one subsection that remained similar to King IV. In fact, very similar. And then the last principle is principle 12. And principle 12 has been reworded. It now says the governing body, in acting in the best interest of the organization over time, adopts a stakeholder inclusive approach which takes into account material stakeholders' interests. And the reason why we took out this balancing idea was that we didn't want to convey that that the intent was, or the objective was, to balance interests. That is not the point. The point is to act in the best interest of the organization, and in doing so, stakeholders' interests are taken into account. The practices have remained largely the same. They slightly modified under the shareholder engagement heading and under the group companies heading. Let me then conclude with this last remark. And that gets back to where I started, namely the media coverage of the draft of King 4. And one of the other statements that I have not mentioned before was that the King codes are a bit like motherhood and apple pie. Now, this is not the first time that I've heard the statement, and I find it quite cute. And of course, this implies like there's no argument against the King codes because they are wholesome. We enjoy them and we think they laudable, like motherhood is, and enjoyable like apple pie is. But I think the King codes are really more than that. As I've explained, they do have consequences. The one question that one of the articles in the media raised was, yes, the King codes are a little bit like motherhood and apple pie. We don't have an objection to it. We think they're wholesome and they're good. But the question is, do they work? And I fully agree with that question. But I also think what we need to keep in mind is that a code of corporate governance is just one of the components into the overarching governance system. A code of corporate governance, like legislation or regulation, can influence but cannot dictate personal values of individuals. It cannot dictate the culture of organizations. In fact, it cannot even dictate the national culture in a country, you know. It cannot it cannot control people's actions and organizations' actions. So what I think we need to do is we need to appreciate that we must present a code that is as easy to use as possible, a code that is clear, a code that addresses the right principles, practices, that provides guidance in the right areas. We must do our very best on all of these elements. But we need to understand, of course, that we have no control over whether it gets implemented or not. But I want to share with you my personal view, and I do think most organizations in South Africa are well intended, and they do want to do the right thing. Those organizations and companies that get into the news, I believe, are the exception. So let's do our bit. Let's do what is under our control and draft the code in the best way that we possibly can so that it's optimized for easy implementation, so that it's logical. And then for that, we require your input because many of you are at the coal face and you see how this works on the ground. So please let the comments let the comments come, and I look forward to engaging with those now and ultimately when you formally comment. Thank you for listening. It was a bit of a marathon session, but I thought I needed to give you all of the information that you needed to make your commentary process as easy as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ansi. Great job as always. And I think that just that depth of knowledge, hearing it from you is just so valuable. There are a lot of questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to try and run through them and also group some of them together. Firstly, someone is asking if you can discuss a little bit more on the 9-year period for NEDs. I know you've covered it, I think, twice in the presentation, but they're making the point that it's hard to find NEDs in certain sectors. I don't know if people are reading it to be that people have to step off after 9 years, which is not the case. Maybe just
Yes.
clarify the link to independence rather than an actual tenure requirement.
Yes, so in King 4 currently we're saying that when a director reaches the 9-year mark in his or her term, then the board should, or the governing body should evaluate whether that director can still be categorized as independent. So that same idea is now repeated in King 5. We just instead of it standing on its own as a practice, we say the governing body on a substance and over form basis must look at all the factors, whether you're a shareholder, whether you're a significant provider of capital, whether you're on the board of a related company, all of that. You know, those are factors that you take into account to determine independence. In the same way as you consider those factors, you must also consider 9 years. So nothing has changed in substance, really. And this is an independence criteria. It doesn't mean you need to step off the board. You can remain on the board, but the governing body must consider, can you still be categorized as independent? That's the issue.
Then there's two questions around the structure, which I'm going to link together. Someone was asking, would it not be better for the glossary and disclosure template to be included in the code itself versus in separate documents, which you did touch on the thinking there. And then somebody else asked the fundamental concepts. Is that going to be part of the code, or is it also going to be a supplementary document?
Yes, so the fundamental concepts, no, it won't be part of the code because we've got the executive summary in the code now. So there's the executive summary in the code of the fundamental concepts, but fundamental concepts as a more detailed document will be a separate document from the code. The way that you can look at it is that instead of looking at the outside of a book cover, what we've done now is by use of the website, we're not going to give you a cover. We're going to give you an index. And so that's what you will see. That's what will confront you if you get to that web page. It's the index. And the index will have these components, or these headings there. You'll see the code, you'll see the disclosure template, you'll see the glossary, fundamental concepts, application and disclosure regime, which is also included in the executive summary, but will be explained in more detail. And then you can just click on those, code, disclosure template, glossary. So we thought it's a more accessible presentation. And that's one of the things that we then ask in your comments on. Is it a more accessible presentation? Certainly for me, I think if I can go to a web page, I want to the glossary, I can go directly there. I don't have to scroll through the code. I can go directly there. That's the whole idea behind it. And then further documentation outside the index would be the members, you know, like just general information and guidance documents.
So someone is saying that several African jurisdictions currently follow either King 3 or King 4 in their codes. And what has been their involvement or their view on our move to King 5?
We have not consulted formally with those jurisdictions, and the commentary period is, of course, also an opportunity for comment in that respect. My hope is that the comment will be positive from the point of view that not much, I mean, the one takeaway home thought, I hope that has come across is that there's really not that much that has changed, maybe in form, but definitely not in substance.
Absolutely agreed. Someone asked us to elaborate on why the graphics and design elements were removed in the code.
Palmy, you dealt with that, so maybe
I'm happy to
you
take
can
it.
explain. Yeah.
Yeah. I think firstly, there will still be some graphics and design, because what I picked up from the question is that people feel that pictures are a little bit easier to understand and take in content. There will still be some elements of graphic and design in the introduction and in the fundamental concepts and supplementary documents. But the issue that we had at the IOD in some of our training was the actual code itself when it came to visually impaired people, and the software that they use to read text to them it wasn't compatible with the current King 4 graphics and visual elements, etc. So we're trying to simplify that to make it usable for visually impaired individuals. This is an interesting one. I'm not sure where the understanding of the practice is coming from. It's talking about a view on whether we should have an internal audit professional on the board or audit committee, similar to how we recommend that CAs must be on the board and audit committee. I'm not sure that we do. So Ansi, just maybe your take on that.
No, we don't make that recommendation.
We don't make any prescription for skills alone.
Correct. So every organization should determine their skills. We try and refrain from being too specific on matters that may differ from organization to organization. So we also, for example, don't prescribe that there must be a technology expert on the board, or that there must be an HR expert, or any of those things. Each organization need to decide their requirements for themselves, depending, and then take into, that's how you tailor make a code of corporate governance, is you shape it to suit your situation and circumstances.
So this is an interesting one. If an organization that's not currently adopting the King reports chooses to rather implement King 4 instead of King 5, because they feel the move to King 5 is more drastic, would we be opposed to that?
I think we would be opposed. But more importantly, what would your market say? What would your customers say? What would your shareholders say? So it doesn't actually matter if we are opposed to it, but it's rather around what your stakeholders expect from you.
Yeah, and maybe also from my side to just add the point that with the reduction in principles and practices and the more clear guidance on disclosure, my view, and just is coming from also working at a non-profit, is it's actually easier to implement King 5, or it should be easier to implement King 5 than it was to implement King 4.
Indeed.
Years ago. Yeah.
That's the whole idea, that it should be easier.
So someone has asked, you mentioned around the supplements that we won't issue separate supplements, that there'll be one guidance document for application of King to various sectors. Someone has asked, is the retirement supplement still going to be maintained or updated? I think the answer is yes, it will be included in that overall guidance document that you mentioned. It won't be a separate supplement per se, but certainly retirement funds will be touched on there.
Correct.
For those who draft integrated reports for companies, could they start applying the 12 principles now already in their governance disclosure versus the 16 in King 4 in anticipation for the final King 4? Or do you think they should, final King 5, or do you think they should wait?
If it was my decision, I would rather wait, because this is a draft, and it's subject to a commentary process. So who knows? The 12 principles may change to 11 or 13, or it may remain the same. But I think I would let the process run its course before I make changes internally.
Sure. The next question is, I think, more of a comment than a question, but maybe just answer your take on it. The concern with the word conformance, that it may be watered down as more compliance than ethics. The individual is saying effective control resonates better in terms of that outcome. Don't know if you have any comment on that.
No, it's a valid comment. This is exactly the purpose of if that's the connotation that it will carry, then we must rethink conformance. That's why I was pains to highlight that conformance is just one of the outcomes. There are the three other: ethical culture, there's performance, and there is legitimacy. So you can't say I've achieved 2 out of the 4 outcomes and therefore I have 50% and therefore I pass. It doesn't work. You need to realize all 4 of the outcomes. And conformance, yes, it is the compliance aspect of governance, but that's not all you're trying to realize.
Absolutely. Then there's a couple of questions around timelines, which I'm sure is a burning question for many, around when we anticipate launching King 5, and then also when we anticipate it being effective or applicable to organizations.
Palmy, you actually know better than me when we're planning the launch. When we anticipate it to be effective, we've always been very lenient on our effective dates and given companies and organizations ample time to make the transition. And then those who want to transition earlier can do so. So I can't tell you exactly what it will be, but it will be similar to the transition period that we used for King 4, which was very lenient. I know the one for King 3 was as well.
Agreed. And in terms of launch, just to inform everyone that it's likely to be towards September, October of this year that we anticipate being able to launch King 5. Disclosure checklist, interesting insight here is, could this lead to tick box rather than meaningful disclosure, something we debated quite a bit at the advisory group when drafting.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly not the intention, as I tried to explain, was it at pains to explain that it's rather to give a useful format and to be more specific on the disclosures. But like, for example, there's that element we're saying here that there should be a narrative included on how the principles that have been implemented achieve the aspiration as per the, sorry, let me start that again. It's like in King 4, there should be a narrative on the practices that have been implemented and how these work together to achieve the aspiration as per the principle. Now, for me, that is the mitigation against tick box reporting. This is the qualitative aspect of reporting. It's not red light, green light, amber light reporting. This is qualitative reporting. It's a narrative. So we try to combine the disclosure, the specific disclosure on which practices have not been applied, with the narrative. We try to balance those two aspects. Again, this is what the commentary process is for. And we want to hear your comments on whether you do think there's a risk that it will be tick boxing, and if so, how can that risk be managed?
Then a question on the disclosure template and whether this will replace the current King 4 application register. I think that's exactly the intention. It is to replace and improve on the current application.
Yes.
Absolutely. This question, I'm not sure if it's actually a King committee question per se, but they're saying some smaller companies are required to publish integrated reports. How are these viewed and where should the publication be done?
Yes, I don't think that we would go into that amount of detail. That is a decision that must be made by the governing body in conjunction with the guidance issued by the IRC of South Africa.
Then in terms of principles, the combination of risk and compliance, someone's commenting that won't this result in more compliance over strategic opportunities? I think, I think some of these are very useful comments that I think I'd encourage members to put into their comment letters for the King Committee to consider. Nancy, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I don't think the mere combination will result in it. And the reality is that the compliance system slots into the broader risk management system. So I don't think so, but other opinions are welcome.
Absolutely. Then the practice that says that the board, the CEO will be a director and one other executive will be an executive director. Why don't we say specifically the CEO and CFO? Why do we leave it open to say the CEO and one other director as determined by the board?
So normally it would, of course, be the CFO, but there are organizations. I worked, for example, for I was a director at a non-profit in the medical sector. And there the finances were ancillary. So the board there appointed the head of the medical director as the medical executive as a director on the board. It was more appropriate for that organization. Again, it's to not be prescriptive and have a certain type of company in your mind, but to appreciate that organizations differ. They have different strategic imperatives. They have different structures. And so it doesn't do any harm to give the board a choice as to who they will appoint as the second director, and it provides more flexibility, which is what we're trying to do. The governance, I say it again, the governance system should be shaped according to the needs of the organization where it's applied, and we're making room for that shaping.
There was a question around cost of implementation for smaller businesses, SMEs, etc. There's a feel that there's a lot of investment in systems, training, and processes required for smaller businesses to implement the King Code.
Well, if you've implemented King 4, I don't think you'll require too much to shift to King 5. It's really a minimal training and effort. And in fact, it's probably a good investment because with all of the simplification, and so we try to make the burden lighter. So I think the shift from King 5 would not bring anything new into that determination if you're already applying King 4. If you're only implementing governance now for the first time, that's of course a different question. And then it's a matter of really understanding how what is proposed in terms of the governance practices can be meaningfully applied proportionally to your organization so that you don't have a system that is excessive compared to your organization. But that does require a bit of investment into how the governance system can best be, to use that word, shaped again.
I think there's more than one question on Practice 81, which is the one where we say even companies who are not required in terms of the Companies Act to present their remuneration policy and reports to the shareholders are encouraged to or recommended to in this practice. People are asking for further clarity on this practice. And someone also asked, is this intended just until the Companies Act is in effect?
No. So the question that the King Committee asked itself was, so even if the Companies Act comes into effect, it is that a bit would be applicable to public companies and state-owned companies. So should other companies actually then also subject their remuneration policy and report to a vote? So it was, I must tell you, this wasn't a uniform decision at the King Committee. Some said yes, it should be, and some said no, we shouldn't. In the meantime, it will serve to cover the gap. But you need to, in your commentary, you need to give us your opinion on whether you do think that, let's say, large private companies which are not listed, whether it would be a good practice for them to also subject their policies and their remuneration report to a non-binding vote.
Then people are asking, how would you apply the requirement for independent non-executive directors in a small company?
In a small company, I would apply the independence criteria in exactly the same way. But when I look at the number of independent directors that I need, the number would probably be less than what you would need in a public company because of proportionality. So for some organizations, it may be enough that you have an independent chair and that the chair is the only independent director. For others, you may say to have any influence, you need at least 3, the rule of 3, independence. Again, it's a determination that needs to be made by the organization itself. But it is absolutely, in terms of proportionality, permissible there's a practice recommendation that says the governing body should consist of a majority of non-executive directors, and a majority of the non-executive directors must consist of independent directors. So if you're a small organization, you're going to apply that proportionally, meaning you're going to apply that to a lesser extent than a bigger company would. These practices are all phrased as ideal practices in an ideal situation. So, and that's why we allow for proportionality.
And also the guidance that we are preparing that will be released with King 5 will expand on that as well in terms of proportionality and then also application to smaller companies, etc.
And the sector supplements actually, sorry, Palmy, the sector supplements actually explain that already, the King 4 sector supplements.
Absolutely. Someone is asking about future plans for the King Code to be available on the Play Store. Probably not. We did have King 4 in an app. We didn't have great uptake. We rather want to have a very freely available and easily used PDF document like you see with legislation, etc. Someone is asking about audit committees, firm rotation. Do we not think it's a good practice to include audit firm rotation into King 5?
We haven't, because we don't want to put in provisions that conflict with those of the regulator. We think it's the regulator's domain, so we haven't included that.
So I see an attendee is suggesting that the word governs in principles 2, 8, and 9 be defined so that it's not interpreted differently. I think that's a useful suggestion to come through in the comment when you do issue your comment letter. There's a question, does paragraph 28 not require retired CEO to have 2-year cooling off period in 25D? I don't have the code in front of me now. I'm not sure what paragraph 28 is. Perhaps Vicky can just help us there if she's got the code open. Does paragraph 28 not require the retired CEO to have a 2-year cooling off period in 25D? Vix, if you can just have a look at that for us, please. We'll move on so long. Ansi, is there consideration to change the name of the King Code to maybe something South African like the SA Code of Corporate Governance?
Not at this stage.
I think the King brand has become synonymous with our Code of Governance in South Africa.
Yeah, everybody knows about it, internationally, when you mention it.
Clarity on 25D, which is about had been in the employ of the organization and as an executive manager prior to the preceding 3 years without serving a cooling off period of at least 2 years. So this is around independence of non-executive directors, this practice that we added. If you can just clarify what was meant by it.
So if you've served as an executive, it's a bit difficult for me if I'm not seeing the wording, but if you served as an executive, you can join, let's say you served as a CEO, you can join the board when you step down as a CEO, you can join the board as a non-executive director, but you cannot join as an independent non-executive. You can't be categorized as independent. What you need to do is that you need to have a cooling period of at least 2 years where you don't have any involvement with the company. And when you then join, you can join as an independent director.
Okay, I just want to come back to the question on paragraph 28. Vicky has informed me 28 is the one that states, Ansi, that the retired CEO should not become chair until 3 years have passed. So they're trying to link that to the independence to say, should there not also be a 2-year cooling off period in this practice? I think useful feedback for us to think about.
Yeah, certainly add that and we can consider. It is perhaps logical.
Yes. For companies, dual listed companies, let's say in SA and the UK, they're making disclosures in the UK. Do they also have to do our disclosure template? And then related to that, we mentioned that disclosure template must be made available on the website. Must it be part of the integrated report?
So so first of all, of course, the disclosure template is a recommendation. It's not a King 5 is not legislation, so it's a recommendation. If you ask me what the idea is, no, the disclosure template is not. We don't recommend that it be part of the integrated report. If you want to make it part, by all means. What we are recommending is that you establish links between your integrated report and your disclosure template so that you don't have to repeat information. Again, if it suits you to rather repeat the information than to include the link, you're also free to do that. How it works for you, but the idea is not to include it as part of your integrated report. The integrated report has its own format, and that format does include that you disclose corporate governance practices. But because if you disclose it in that format, your corporate governance disclosure is across that report all over. And so we're saying bring it back to one point where it's accessible from one point. It's easier to evaluate.
So someone's asking, once the comment period is done and the King Committee assesses the comments, will the public have another opportunity to comment once we've reviewed the comments, or will the final version of King 5 be issued? I think the answer is there won't be another comment period. The King Committee will take the comments into consideration. But just in terms of transparency, we will also be publishing a document with themes of the comments we received and responses and how they were dealt with in the final King 5. Why is there a need to have a separate principle for information governance when risk and compliance have been combined? I'm reading this to say, could they not all three have been combined?
I think so. The King Committee felt that was taking it a step perhaps too far, seeing how prominent an issue information governance is. And not only is it prominent, because there are other prominent things like climate change that we're not dealing with separately, but I think what makes information governance unique is that it's got it doesn't slot neatly under risk management like compliance does. Information governance got its intricacies that need that are unique and that need to be looked at differently. So that's why we kept it as a separate principle. So again, provide us your comments in this regard and we will look at it. But where things stand with information governance, I can't see how we can justify just information governance. The truth of it is it can't be seen as a mere risk management subset. It's too strategic.
And then someone's asking, will the King Committee at some stage publish outcomes, challenges, benefits achieved in regard to prior King codes? I don't know if we have an answer for that now, but I think it's something we can consider. What's your view on investors using the 9-year tenure as a proxy voting rule? It's often disruptive to the balance of skills on the board. King 5 should retain the practice that directors serving longer than 9 years can still serve as a director subject to the independence assessment. I think it's implied that it is retained. There's nothing saying otherwise. Yeah,
exactly. No, it is retained like that. And yes, it is disruptive, and it's for that reason that we try and keep the code and its application as flexible as we can, so that circumstances and situations can be taken into account when practices are implemented.
Someone is suggesting iCraft should have been expanded to include courage. I mean, that can come through in comment letters for consideration. Someone is saying King 5 only differs in form, not substance. So you can stick with King 4, ?
Yeah, but if the form makes it easier, why not?
Do we think the amendments will really improve the governance regimes in state-owned entities?
Yeah, it's like the thoughts I concluded with. The Code of Corporate Governance, you can draft it in a way that is really optimal, but you have no control over whether it gets implemented. So as far as things are under our control, we are really doing our best and discussing matters and issues and try and be as thoughtful and mindful about it as we possibly can, using all the wisdom at the disposal of the King Committee and all of the wisdom of you going to comment. And I think that's what we can do. But do we have control over other components in the system of governance? No, we don't. We try our best to influence and to advocate, but there are limitations.
Will King 4 become obsolete post the publication of King 5? I think you've sort of touched on it in that there is the latest code only, and there will be sufficient time given to progress from one to the other. I think just the overarching comment is, once a new code is released, that is considered the code of governance and replaces previous versions. Effective date, I think we've spoken about that. We will share that, but people will be given ample time to transition. A number of Principle 10 remuneration disclosure recommendations have been removed or consolidated. We assume it's in response to the Companies Act. Can you give a view on the rationale of this?
Well, yeah, it's in response to the Companies Act and also to simplify.
So specifically, guidance around background policy and implementation report sections, the members commenting, is not explicitly covered in the Companies Act. But I think that's one of those where we said it was guidance. It could be covered in guidance rather than being practice recommendations.
Exactly. And the other thing that must be kept in mind, remember, there are regulations to the Companies Act that are still outstanding. And we suspect that that's the reason why that part of the Companies Act has not been made effective, because it needs regulations to make it effective.
The code is silent on NED tenure. Was that intentional, and what is the best practice? I think you've covered that so when you cover the 9-year question somewhat, but you have something to add.
No, we're silent. Each company must decide whether it wants to put a term limit on an ultimate term limit on service of its non-executive directors. It's not something that we are contemplating.
Why is an IT committee not recommended as a compulsory committee, considering the evolving technology, etc.? I'm just going to read these 3 questions under this part. Why is the audit committee not chaired by an independent member and not a board member to ensure independence?
No, it's certainly the idea that it be chaired by an independent member. Also remember, state-owned entities, audit committees don't always consist of board members. So we wrote it more generically. But if you're a company, the idea is that your audit committee, the requirement is in any event for all of the audit committees to be independent. So the chair would be independent. I don't know if this question is more about the independence or more about the board member, but if it's about the board member, then it's because state-owned entities don't always have board members on the audit committee.
Then the IT committee question, Nancy?
Again, it could be proposed. That is something I think that it would be difficult to neatly ring fence. It is probably something that influences both strategy and risk, and because technology is so pervasive, I'm not sure that I'm not sure. I think it's an option for companies to establish a technology committee. We didn't think it was necessary in the King 5 code to recommend it. We didn't recommend it in King 4 either. So I'm still not quite convinced that it needs a separate committee. But there may be certain companies where, because of the nature of their operations and business, they may want to establish one. And it's fine. You establish your committees as you deem fit.
Then there's 2 questions around integrated reports again. If a company with one shareholder needs even to do an integrated report, and the other ways owner-managed businesses if they need to do it. I think we've sort of answered that question in terms of proportionality. So I think organizations can consider whether they apply that practice or not. And then maybe just to add on is that it's not always just about how many shareholders you have, because the integrated report, there may be other stakeholders in the organization who are interested in the integrated report. But again, proportionality, and I think fit for purpose for your organization. And this one is about ethical leadership and whistleblower protection. In relation to what we see at the moment, do you think more needs to be done to promote whistleblower protection? I don't think that's a question related to King 5, more of a general question, maybe your views, Ansi.
It may be necessary. I agree with you, Palmy. I don't think it's necessarily a King 5 question. There are various institutions that work to achieve exactly that, but it's important that we protect and safeguard our whistleblowers and protect them in various ways, and not only in what we say, but also in what we do to protect them and safeguard them from losing their jobs, becoming unemployable because they've got this reputation of being a whistleblower. So I definitely agree with the sentiment. I just don't think that King 5 is the place to do so. I'm not also even sure that the person intended that, who asked the question.
Then what role can advisory boards or subcommittees play in having more young professionals for board positions? Again, not really a King 5 question, more of a general opinion question.
Yeah, I think that's a question for you, Palmy.
I'd encourage the member to read my latest article on advisory boards where I talk about the pitfalls of them. And it's on the IOD website under articles. Please clarify how conflicts of interest cuts through King 5. It still presents itself as an elephant in the room, given the fact that South Africa faces a scarcity with respect to members of governing bodies. How is conflict of interest effectively illustrated in this draft?
Conflicts of interest and how they should be dealt with is dealt with in the Companies Act, and we're saying in the code that even organizations not subject to the Companies Act should follow that same process. And then you've got independence on the other hand, which is of course not the same as a conflict of interest. And organizations need to weigh up the various considerations, their need for independent directors, but then also weigh that up against the availability of competent directors to serve. I'm not sure I've answered this question, but yeah, I think that's about the bottom line of it.
Then many small private companies, non-profits, or even large private companies just don't adopt King 4. It obviously can't be forced on them. So what happens is then they don't apply independence. They continue with unethical practices, whatever the case is. Any comments on this?
This is where, and that is, again, getting back to this idea that corporate governance is a system. So we put out the guiding practices. The King Committee doesn't have enforcement capability, which we all know. And unless an organization is regulated and there's some sort of an oversight and requirement to implement sound governance practices, then it becomes the shareholders or the customers or those who finance the organization that need to insist that good governance is applied. That's the only way that it can work absent formal regulation that makes it applicable to smaller companies.
Quite a nice question, Jan. What practical steps an organization can take to transition from King 4 to King 5?
Yeah, that is a nice question. So, you know, the old trusted spreadsheet, I think that's not a bad starting point, as long as it remains the starting point and not the end point. And as long as it's very clearly understood that the practices that you implement, you need to reflect on those practices as a whole under each principle to say, if we implement this, will this result, or is it likely to result in the achievement of the aspiration as per the principle? And so, yes, the answer is yes, that trusted spreadsheet just to guide you through the thinking process, but then add to that your reflection on if we have then decided to apply proportionally as follows, so in other words, some of the boxes are ticked and others are not, can we explain around the boxes that we've not ticked, why we're not implementing them? The fact that we're not implementing them, is that putting us at risk of not achieving the principle? If so, let's rethink, or let's think about putting in place a mitigating practice. And then once you've been through this determination and you look at those that have the ticks as a collective, will they collectively, these practices, achieve the aspiration of the principle? Is it likely? And if the answer is yes, then go ahead and assess it regularly as to whether it has indeed achieved the aspiration as per the practice.
Then what is our view on independence of an individual who, say, was the CEO and resigns and without the cooling off period returns and is appointed as a NED? I think that that's answered. I mean, nothing prevents the person from coming in as an NED, but there certainly is a consideration of independence that needs to be had by the board if there has been no cooling off period. Someone is saying, if I put it in short, can we say the changes between King 4 and King 5 is 1, updated packaging, and 2, digitalization? I think it's a bit more than that. Ansi?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say repackaging is a little bit, disclosure, the information governance practices look quite a bit different, as well as the principle. I suppose you could summarize it in that way. It's and maybe just to wrap your head around it, it's good to summarize it that way. But I'm always wary of missing some of the nuances.
Absolutely. Also, I guess not related to King 5 directly, but what is your view when a board member wishes to become an executive of the company? So I'm assuming a non-executive applies for a role as an executive. Another one where there is an article on this exact topic, a guidance note, both ways, NED to ED and ED to NED, considerations and pitfall on the IOD website.
I'll defer to that then.
Sure, someone's asking the difference between a non-executive director and an independent non-executive director. Seems to be a very thin line between the two.
So just in brief, an independent non-executive director is a non-executive director who is free from any associations, interests, influences which may to an objective third party appear to be likely to cause a bias in that person's decision making. That's the overarching definition. And then there's a practice recommendation in King 4. It's practice recommendation 28 under principle 7, which addresses the factors that may indicate that your independence has been impeded. And those factors have been repeated but tweaked in King 5. So I think to understand exactly when a non-executive director can be regarded as independent or not is to go look at those factors.
Then a couple of questions that maybe I can take. Will hard copies of King 5 be available? So we won't publish hard copies. It will be available digitally or online on our website by the IOD. But I'm sure many of the large publishing houses will choose to publish hard copies like they currently do with King 4. Will there be another information session before the launch? Probably not. These information sessions that we're running now are really aimed at clarifying things for people before they comment and informing their comment letters. I don't think there'll be need for another information before the launch because the launch itself will contain a lot of information, discussion, and guidance. And we'll certainly keep our members informed of those plans. King 4 was a very collaborative process with several working sessions with a broad-based market participant. Is the intention to do the same with King 5 post the receipt of comments?
No, we've consulted somewhat, but not to the extent that we have for King 4. And it's because the changes from King 4 to King 5 are really to a lesser extent than from King 3 to King 4. Also remember the King Committee represents various stakeholders in the governance sphere. So we have the input readily available for that. We have gone outside to check certain things, to assess certain things, etc. But we haven't embarked upon a comprehensive consultation process.
What key aspects did we consider under Practice 75, which is the one on AI, the new practice on AI? The person is glad to see it's in the code, but it's asking what key aspects did we consider in drafting it?
We looked at AI from the perspective of what it strategically means for an organization. And we looked at it from various perspectives, and that's why we use that word deploy. Because after research, we found that deployment is probably the best term for it. And it's, if I remember right, also defined in the glossary. No, it's defined, it's expanded upon in the practice. That's right. So deployment includes use, distribution, sale. I can't now remember, but we try and encapsulate all of the facets in which AI can be used by an organization. So we looked at that. And depending on how it is used, it will have a different strategic imperative. And then we viewed AI from a risk perspective, particularly, and we tried to keep that at a very high level, which was very complex and took a lot of discussion and deliberation and, as I said, research. This is one area on which we got quite a bit of outside input.
Are there any changes to the company secretary's role worth noting?
No, nothing I would say worth noting. It remained fairly similar. So, some simplification, but other than that, nothing.
Then someone saying the 9-year term should be made compulsory with a number of reasons. I think we'll welcome
Look at that.
comments. Yeah, if that comes through. Will there be follow-up sessions once King 5 is finalized to assist organizations? I'm sure there will definitely be. Please explain the meaning of apply and explain. What does it actually mean? And is it adopted the same as in King 4?
Yes, exactly the same as in King 4. So apply the principles and explain the practices. Why we just saying you don't need to explain on the principles is because the principles are fundamental and basic to governance. So when you, as an organization, you set out to follow good governance, you can't argue against the principles. There is no principle for which you can make a rational argument that you're not going to implement or apply that principle. So we're saying, we're assuming that you are striving to apply all of the principles to the best of your ability. You don't need to explain there. So apply the principles and explain the practices. Explain the practices that you've not implemented and why. And secondly, explain how the practices that you have implemented achieves the aspiration as per the principle. And if you can read in the application and disclosure section in King 4, if you want to understand that more, it will follow exactly the same regime in King 5.
Then someone making another comment about company secretaries, why not specifically recommend that they should report to the CEO, linking to Practice 62, which relates to the stature and authority of the company secretary. I think, again, that can come through in comment letter and will be considered there. Do you have any comments on NEDs carrying out work for the company, either without expecting payment or with expecting payment, like consulting type work?
There's not in principle a problem with that. It depends on the extent of it. And it may affect and impair your independence if you provide consulting services to a significant extent and on an ongoing basis to the organization. But I think in smaller companies, in non-profits, non-executive directors do get involved in consulting. Just be careful of, like I say, independence. and that you don't overstep that line into operations and put yourself in a position where you have to mark your own homework. So I have to be thought out very carefully.
Any chance the deadline for public comment will be extended? I think it's unlikely, since we felt the 6-week timeline was reasonable and fair for people to send their comments through. The application of King 4 report, has it fallen away? Well, as we mentioned earlier, King 5 will replace King 4 once it becomes effective. AI, is there sufficient guidance for boards to make sure it's responsibly developed and deployed or used by the company? I think, from King 4, we've covered to the extent that, in King 5, we've covered to the extent that we can. And certainly, I'm sure more guidance will follow from various parties. Ansi, you wanted to add?
Yeah, so we were very clear on that in all of our principles. King 4, King 5, these are codes of containing guiding standards. These are not guidance documents as such. That's why I specifically mentioned that we will post on that website where you will access the code. That's the place where we will post guidance documents. Also, the guidance in the respective areas will be provided and have been provided by the various organizational bodies who are experts in these respective subject areas. So please don't see King 5 as a guidance document. That's not, it sets out the guiding standards, but it's not a guidance document. Guidance you would need to find elsewhere.
A question around how King 5 cuts across the new American policies, for example, prohibition of diversity, equity, inclusion, etc.
Yeah, we haven't changed our stance. Yeah. We South Africans.
How does the AI practices relate to the OECD international guidance on AI?
We looked at so many I know we looked at ISO we looked at so many standards. I can't tell you now how it compares to the OECD specifically.
Someone is asking, is it correct to reference King 5 draft report in companies' internal reports, considering that it has not been finalized yet? I think if you're referring to it as a draft, there's nothing preventing that. I think the overarching thing is just not to consider it final, because things may change. So be clear to treat it and call it draft. Does our reporting disclosure align with the GRI disclosures?
No. Well, not... The GRI disclosures is something completely different from what we have in King 4. So you will remember that I said to you that how we dealt with it is that, so we don't cover the GRI disclosures. All that we say, we have a practice recommendation that says the governing body should consider and approve which reporting standards, guidance, frameworks are implemented by the organization. So what we are saying, as a governing body, you consider the GRI standards because that's a credible, high-level, widely used standard. So that's probably one of those that will be considered by almost all organizations. And then as a governing body, you decide whether you're going to follow that standard. That's what King 4 recommends that you do. But we don't attempt to cover anything in the GRI or in any other standard in King 5.
Then there's a comment, an interesting comment. Sometimes a principle is just not applicable and you don't apply it, but explain the reason why, surely. And I think this is, again, goes to your differentiation between principles and practices. So the principles, I don't think, can ever be not applicable to any company. That's how it's been written, to be universally applicable. Practices certainly can be not applicable, and those can be explained.
So can any risk management system or any governance system afford to be without a risk management system, or without a systematic approach to ethics, or not take into account your stakeholders? You can't explain that away reasonably.
Then someone's making a comment, in their view, the combined assurance model in an organization should cover the integration of the IT committee. I think that can come through in comment later. Will the disclosure template now, will you have to publish a disclosure template now and not the annual application report? Yes, that's correct. We have touched on that a little bit earlier. King4 is silent on cryptocurrency and how it can be applied. Was this intentional, Ansi?
It wasn't. No, we didn't consider it. If you think it's something that needs to be considered, you can motivate for it, but we did not consider it.
What is your view regarding disclosures of remunerations in relation to top execs, considering their rights to personal protection and the increased risk of abductions of these individuals, etc.? So I guess the interplay between disclosure and then privacy.
I don't think that, and we're so far down the road. I think executive remuneration needs to be disclosed. The Companies Act requires it. I can't see that that will be changed in a hurry. That's internationally how it happens. Privacy considerations, yes, it is a consideration, but on balance, I think transparency weighs more.
So those are all the questions that I see in the Q&A. Sorry, one has just come in. Nothing on the wage gap inequality optional reporting.
No, we didn't include that because the Companies Act deals with it. We anticipate that once it becomes effective, the Companies Act will deal with that. And we're not repeating what's in the Companies Act.
All right, if there are no further questions, because I'm not seeing any now in our Q&A box that haven't been answered, I think from my side is thanking all of you for joining the session and engaging with us. And we look forward to receiving your comment letters and considering the inputs. Ansi, thank you to you. I always say no one can do this as well as you. You've got just such a depth of knowledge and experience on these things. And thank you so much, everybody. We have 2 minutes until the end of the session, so really good timing, Ansi, in terms of your presentation and handling the questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Palmy. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
I've been trying to do it right. I've been living a lonely life. I've been sleeping here instead. I've been sleeping in my bed. Sleeping in my bed.